Hello and welcome to a Taylor's Tales podcast. This is Chris's Corner. I'm your host, Chris Taylor, and we're back this week with a brand new podcast, the History Podcast. I'm continuing the theme, and we're going to be looking into specifically a brand new era. I know I'm skipping between areas. We're going from Russia to Japan. It's almost look like I'm just going all over the place. It's Chrissy chaos at the moment, you know. We're looking at the Crusades, and specifically within the Crusades, the Templars. And I find this group and this period of history fascinating because it offers such a two sides to the story, and yet at the same time, both sides seem to be fighting for the same thing. Both fighting on, let's start with what the Crusades are. What are the Crusades? The Crusades were wars in the 11th, 12th, and 13th century, specifically between 1096 AD to around, I want to say, yeah, 1290, no, 12, yeah, 1200. I'm getting my numbers right. Anyway, like it was the end of the beginning of the 13th century, the beginning of the 11th century, and the Crusades were religious wars that were there to basically proclaim Holy Land in the name of both Christian faith, Muslim faith, and I believe at the time even the Holy Roman Empire that was fading away was also being proclaimed at the beginning of the Crusades. So, starting off from there, we have why were the Crusades started in the first place? And the main reason they were started was because the Roman Empire was fading away, and the Roman Empire that was left was the Byzantine Empire, which was basically the remnants of the Roman Empire's power than Constantinople, and the epicenter of what was considered at the time the trade center of the world. And the idea was that you were going to have, if you had control of Constantinople, you had the control of the whole of Eastern Europe, basically, because of the ability to trade and the ability to control the port itself that had entry into both Europe and into Eastern Europe, and Asia for that matter. And from there, the Byzantine emperor at the time, I believe, I want to say, is it Alexander or is it? I think it's. I want to say Alexius the First, who goes to the Pope at the beginning of the 11th century. He says to the Pope, Pope, I need your help. I am in a conundrum with the Turks at the moment. I'm currently fighting them off. I want my land back. Give me my land back. I want my Holy Land, and I need your help doing so. And so at the time, the sort of Western powers of Europe were beginning to grow. You had what was known at the time as Francia slash France that was up and coming. You had Britain. You had the Germanic powers that were sort of they were Germany wasn't a place at the moment, and neither was most of the countries you know nowadays in in Western Europe, but there were major kings and kingdoms that the Pope had control over through Catholicism at the time, and this included basically Britain, France, and parts of Germany, and basically southern slash Western Europe. And the Pope, I believe, I want to say, yeah, I think it was, yeah, the Pope. I've got it written down here somewhere in my notes. The yeah, the Pope called the Western Christians to take up arms to aid up the Byzantines and recapture the Holy Land from Muslim control. So that was it. It wasn't just the Turks. I said the Turks earlier. What I meant was Muslim. See, when I say Muslim, that was the religion, but the people themselves were a mixture of Northern African and Middle Eastern. So saying Muslim was the faith, but the actual peoples themselves were located throughout northern Africa and sort of the Middle East, and even the Middle East doesn't really narrow it down. It's closer to Europe than it is to the Far East itself, aka the Middle East. I know I'm not specifying it down because there's so many countries. Jerusalem was at the time the Holy Land that we're talking about here, by the way. If I haven't specified that, we are going all over the place at the moment. But the Crusades it was a dark time. It's a dark time where religion was purely the only way to basically control the rabble and to proclaim God's will over man and say that this is the way and this, God wills it, as they say in Kingdom of Heaven. Fantastic movie, and I will be referencing it throughout this, because when I first came into sort of knowledge of the Crusades, the Templars, it was through video games and it was through small, cartoons from when I was younger. I think I remember watching Robin Hood at some point and the mentioning of the Crusades by Richard III, the Lionheart. And I think we all get these little snippets of history through, if you haven't studied the historical events at the time, through alternative resources, alternative like areas. Even if Assassin's Creed, the video game, that it's not a reliable resource, but it's there. It gives you some inkling into and specifically the Third Crusade, even though there's 8 expeditions in total to the Holy Land and back. It's really 3 crusades that most people zone in on, and they happen around, I want to say 50 years in between each, and the third one is the longest, believed to be around 70 years in duration from the, I think it's, yeah, I think I've got it written down, 1208 all the way up until, did I just say 70 years? It's probably like 17 years. What am I talking about? Crazy. Yeah. So 27. But at the time, I think it was Richard the Lionheart who was in the final crusade. And his name gets thrown around a lot relating to all of them. So, to specify it a little bit, it's the third crusade that he's a part of. The Templars themselves, they weren't really a part of the first crusade. They were mainly part of the second, and they were starting to lose their power in the third, purely because they weren't really invented as a group until around, I want to say, 1100. Yeah, 1100, around that time, AD. So yeah, let's get into some specifics. I've got it in my notes here on the left. Yeah, at the time of the 11th century, Western Europe was coming into power. I've said this. In November of 1095, the Council of Clermont in southern France was called, and I said the Western Europe was rallied, and the Crusades set the stage for several religious knightly military orders, including the Knights Templar, the Teutonic Knights. I've not said that right. It's probably, yeah, Teutonic Knights, and the Hospitaliers, who were specifically I'm pretty sure there was very minimum knights and majority were religious, sort of, I want to say, friars and tucks and stuff like that. They were men of God. Not saying that the Templars weren't, because we'll get into that in a bit, in the sense that the majority of the Templars were not actually a fighting order. Um, and that's one thing that gets confused. And before this, like I said, I didn't really know a lot about the Templars until this point. There's a lot of mystery around them, the Templars. Ooh, they still live out today. It's like the idea of what's the group called in that everyone thinks controls the world? I think it's it's the Great Eye, isn't it, in the pyramid? And it will come to me in a minute. But moving on from there, like these shadow groups, these groups that apparently control the world through power and banking and everything like that, and money and resources. And don't get me wrong, we do realize within this sort of region that the Templars do gain a lot of power through financial financial advising, financial obtaining, financial resources, being able to hold people accountable for the first time ever in history, basically. And that's fascinating to know. I'm going to keep saying that word because to me it really is the ability to purely function in a time where a man can cut another man down in the name of God or in the name of anyone that would basically put him in the right. And at the time, if they were a lord or of higher class, would get away with murder, and it would not even people wouldn't even flinch. So to be able to hold an order that is able to hold people accountable financially and also through land and sort of possession, it's and to have lasted that period of time between 1100 to around 1300 is fascinating, even after the Crusades end. So, who are the Knights Templar? Well, I've gone into a few bits of an overview, but the real thing about the Knights Templar are that they are a religious group of men originally who were formed because sort of I want to say pilgrims who want to visit the Holy Land. It's been captured by in the First Crusade, as I said earlier. The knights aren't formed until the 1100, and from there they formed to be able to protect the pilgrim road, the passage to be able to get to the Holy Land, to be able to get to Jerusalem. And it's because sort of the Muslim army or the army of the non-Christians uh, basically attack these pilgrims. Now we don't, you know, we can't say that every time in history that this is necessarily true because it's written record by the victors at the end of the day, which is in a lot of the cases, Saladin doesn't necessarily get a lot of words in edgeways for historical record down the line. And if we look at it from the point of view of the Christian faith, there is the idea of blasphemy and sort of that these were heretics and devils and devil worshippers because they didn't believe in the same thing as they did. Ironically, Muslim and Christian and all of these religions are one and the same because of their beliefs and their rules. However, at the time, that was not the case, and men were not so level headed in their analysis of religion. And it was purely based off a hierarchy of who was closer to God and knew what he was saying, basically. And it was a he at that time, I can tell you that now. Yeah, so after Christian armies captured Jerusalem from the Muslims' control in 1099 during the Crusades, groups of pilgrims from across Western Europe started visiting the Holy Land. Many of them, however, were robbed and killed as they crossed through Muslim controlled territories during the journey. And so from there, around 1180, like I said, 1100, a French knight named Hugues de Payon created a military order along with 8 relatives and acquaintances, calling it the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ and the Temple of Solomon, later known simply as the Knights Templar. Funny enough, the Temple of Solomon is the temple that was given to them by Baldwin II in Jerusalem. At the top, I think at the time of the group's forming, they agreed with Baldwin that they would protect the pilgrims traveling to Jerusalem, and that they needed a base somewhere to hold the group together and to meet. And he gave them the temple, which would be known as the Temple of Solomon, which was therefore become the Knights Templar. And from there, we start to see the rise of the Templars. The Templars themselves were, as you can see there, originally formed out of, really quite, I don't want to say, I don't want to say they were sort of purely good, because, every group as they grow larger has less control over the message that they have, and history doesn't look well on the Templars because the Catholic Church had such control over history, and that sort of repeats the idea I said earlier, where the victors control how history is written. The Catholic Church had control over history for such a long time because of its power, not just through religion, but physical, structural power through the amount of churches it had, the amount of people in its organization, the amount of money and resources it was provided by the people who were much poorer off than them. The whole organization was just a powerhouse. And even with the Roman Empire gone, it would continue to control people through the use of the word of God. And so that's it's quite an important point, because we'll see within the Templars how quickly they can go from being their best, the favorites of the Catholic Church, to being cast out. And it's interesting to say that. So the first headquarters of the Knights Templar on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. The Crusaders called it the Temple of Solomon, from the location derived the name Templar. Initially, the Knights Templar faced criticism for some religious leaders, but in 1129 the group received the formal endorsement of the Catholic Church and support from Bernard of Clavière, a prominent French abbot. I'm just going to pause there for a second. It's very interesting to know that a French abbot bolstered and backed the Templars themselves, because it's actually France, the country who would be a haven for the Templars for a long time, would actually end up destroying the group itself. Spoilers, I know, but it's a very important point to see at the beginning. The Catholic Church, a French abbot backing them, a singular, a group, an organization, and a singular power person within a Western European country. It all starts from there, and quite strangely, it ends in a very similar way. So, in 1139, Pope Innocent, nice name, the second. So two people thought they were innocent in time. Way, not in the Catholic Church. There's no one innocent in there, and I'm not getting into that. Issued a papal bull that allowed the Templars special rights. Among them, the Templars were exempt from paying taxes, permitted to build their own oratories. I don't know if I've said that right, by the way. And I'm guessing that means religious buildings and temples, and had to and were held to no one's authority except the Pope's. So you see what I mean here? There's a real link between the Catholic Church and the Templars, and it's fascinating to see that this group were created purely out of the sort of, they weren't linked to the Catholic Church. They were there as a religious group who were trying to help pilgrims, and trying to help those try to get into the Holy Land without being robbed or killed. And I think it's important to keep this in mind, because it's almost altruistic, their start. These original members were thinking to themselves that, it's not, they're not doing this for money or wealth or the ability to control finance within the Western European parts of the world, as well as in the Holy Land. So yeah, let's get into the peak of the Knights Templar, which is, there's a great amount of it, even though they're, a couple of 100 years or so, give or take, isn't a long period of time for a group. But within these times, as I said earlier, it's quite impressive to be able to hold this. So one of the things that truly really caught my eye when I saw the information about them is that 90% of the Templars group at their peak of their power were not knights. They were not fighting body. 90% of them were actually basically paperwork guys. They did the banking side of things. And you may be thinking to yourself, well, Chris, what do you mean banking? This isn't, this is a group of knights who were protecting pilgrims on the road. There's no banking behind that. Well, the Templars actually became a group of people where the Crusaders across time would give them their land, money, any sort of special resource or something of value to be held in an account in a bank, to be held over time, and they would be paid, and they would also create checks. The idea to take money from one place in Europe and be able to cash that same money that they've provided the bank in the Holy Land, for instance, by going through the Templars. I mean, at the time, this is beyond technology. This is beyond the system itself and the reliability of the Templars, who are backed by the Catholic Church, which is known throughout Europe and can be used as a sort of backing or safe bet, almost like how we, well, I say we trust the banks now. We don't really trust. It's more of a double-edged sword, isn't it? Really, we have no other choice. And it could have been the same way there. They had the Catholic Church banking, just like we have countries banking nowadays, where are backed by the governments. The Catholic Church were basically a government in their own right. They were that powerful. And so we go in here. So, as I said, non-combatant members of the order, who made up as much as 90% of their members, manage a large economic infrastructure throughout Christendom, developing innovative financial techniques that were an early form of banking, building its own network of nearly 1,000 commanderies and fortifications across Europe and the Holy Land, and arguably farming the world's first multinational corporation. How crazy is that? That's chaos in itself. That's madness. The idea that in the 11 and 1200s you had basically one of the first ever corporations. The Knights Templar were Microsoft before Microsoft. You know what I mean? Like the ability. I shouldn't. They're not a banking business. More, Lloyd's or HSBC or anyone like that, who are big banking groups. They had that power and they had the ability to use that. And so it's fascinating to see that a group that wasn't necessarily created for this manner became such a international powerhouse in its ability to control resource through the credibility of the Catholic Church and through their ability to cover Christendom and the Holy Land. Okay. So we've talked about finances. Well, let's talk about a little bit of the actual fighting, like Chris, we've been talking about financial infrastructures. It's boring. We want to talk about some killing or something like that. You're right, guys. You're right. One of the greatest victories, and I've got it here in my notes, is yes, one of the most famous victories was in 1177 during the Battle of Montgisard. I can't say that. Montgisard, where 500 Templars helped several thousand infantry defeat Saladin's army of more than 26,000 soldiers. A French translated quote of the time said, "A Templar knight is truly a fearless knight and secure on every side, for his soul is protected by the armor of faith, just as his body is protected by the armor of steel. He is doubly armored and in need of neither demon nor man." Wow, it's just like that's said by Bernard de Clairvaux. Clairvaux. You're gonna have to bear with me, guys, with this. It's yeah, it's absolutely stunning to see that they were so well organized, so well trained. So even though only 10% of the organization were fighting men, that 10% were just dominant in their ability to take on other armies and be able to take on other sort of regions and factions within the Holy Land. And we don't know many stories. I can give you a overview, a little taster of what the knights are, but the truth is behind this is that we don't know enough. We don't know. We can't thoroughly confirm that these resources are reliable because of the time period. There's no written proper records at the time. I'm pretty sure that at some point in history, either the Catholic Church or the Church in itself called it blasphemous to write words down because it was the devil's work. So you see how stuff can be said in the name of God and not necessarily sort of back the idea, even though the Bible was written. So, strange. A nobleman who was interested in participating in the Crusades might place all his assets under Templar management while he was away, accumulating wealth in this manner throughout Christendom and the outer reaches of the Holy Land in the order of 1150 began generating letters of credit for the pilgrims journeying to the Holy Land. Pilgrims deposited their valuables with a local Templar president before embarking, received a document indicating the value of their deposit, then used that document upon arrival in the Holy Land to retrieve their funds in the amount of a treasury equivalent value. Like I said, amazing. It's so cool. And that's 1150. 1150 and you have checks. It's just, I mean, nowadays you don't even need to do that. You just have a bank transfer and you're anywhere in the world and you get there, through electricity and through computers and through ones and zeros on a computer, and bingo, you're there. But then, you have to think about it. That those valuables, right? Normally, you had to physically trade valuables, horses, gems of kind, physical valuables to be able to get food, get water, get any sort of armor or anything like that in any place across Europe and the Middle East. The ability for a group, an organization, or a corporation, as my notes have put there, is outstanding. How they've been able to fundamentally change the way, trade is done there. It's quite, I would say, the bigger groups like the Catholic Church and nations would be worried. Think about the power that's occurred through financially occurring people's sort of valuables. It gives them some sort of power over others, and it builds up through the interest that they gain because people that they're holding onto the value of the valuables, and from there they're able to mount up and build the organization further. And more people wanted to join the Templars because of their mission, because of the altruism behind fighting on behalf of God, because they had the red cross across their armor and the white background. It was very holy. It was a religious group, and so you were able to have this corporation, this group organization, which had this religious sort of backing that showed that it was beyond man and it was in the name of God. And so, but what they were really doing was cold, calculated, and making them a lot of money. So it's, this is why I imagine their fall would be imminent, because at that time you look at that group and they would be a threat to so many people. And although in most sort of depictions in them, Assassin's Creed, as I've said before, within Kingdom of Heaven, within a lot of the tales that we see the Templars are the bad guys, and we see them as the guys who control through power, manipulation, and murder. And it's quite interesting to think of them in a different way, rather than as murderers or even seeking the Holy Land, as merely just a business. I love that phrase from Pirates of the Caribbean. It's just good business. And he's like walking into chaos. It's the same thing, isn't it? There's no, it's gone from altruism, protecting people, to cashing checks across from Western Europe all the way to the Holy Land. Crazy. So this was an innovative arrangement, which was an early form of banking and may have been the first formal system to support the use of checks, like I said. Based on this mix of donations and business dealings, the Templars established financial networks across the whole of Christendom. They acquired large tracts of land, both in Europe and in the Middle East. They bought and managed forms of vineyards. They built massive stone cathedrals and castles. They were involved in manufacturing, import, and export. They had their own fleet of ships. And at one point, they even owned the entire island of Cyprus. The Order of the Knights Templar arguably qualify as the world's first multinational corporation. As I've said twice now, multinational corporation in the 1100s to 1200s. How crazy is that? The audacity and the just outrageous sort of back then, if you thought that you were above, or if you thought of an idea that was going to be, beyond reason or beyond the system, you were cast out, you were killed, you were a leper basically. And the idea of Christ, and during that period of time, any ideas that weren't within monarchies or within government control or within Christendom, it was just thrown aside, and you were classed as the the devil, as they did to the Muslims, because they had different ideas, they believed in a different Bible of sort, and they also believed in different rules and ways of life, and that scared people. And looking at difference is always hard for people to deal with. So I've given you a nice overview there of some of the things, as well as some of the events, that how at their peak of their power, what were they able to do. So let's look into the fall of the Knights Templar, which is also just as fascinating. So the order was active until 1312, which was then suppressed by Pope Clement, by Bulvox in, I can't even read the last bit there, Exilus. Pope Clement V, right? We see the Pope Innocent II being the creator, the audacity, the print. He put his stamp on the Templars and said, "These guys only answer to me." And it was then also another Pope who would therefore say that the Templars were no longer under protection of the Pope, and they would answer to others. It's, as I said, it's a circle in itself, because it starts where it ends, and it begins where it ends where it begins, and begins where it ends. Fascinating. In 1305, the new Pope Clement V, based in Avignon, France, again France, we said this before, sent letters to both the Templar Grand Master Jacques de Molay and the Hospitaller Grand Master Fluc de Villeray to discuss the possibility of merging the two orders. Neither was amenable, so they weren't cool to the idea, but Pope Clement persisted, and in 1306 he invited both Grand Masters to France to discuss the matter. From there, when they met in France, when they eventually got to France, because the Hospitaller leader didn't get to France until, I think it was 7 months after the Grand Master of the Templars. And in that period of time, there were inquiries into the Templars, looking into their sort of interactions with both France, with both citizens and lords. And the idea was that the Catholic Church, they weren't okay. Originally the Pope, it says in here that the allegations were, there was no charges, there was nothing shown by there was no evidence. But with King Philip's backing, who, quite slyly, he owed the Templars a lot of money, he looked to destroy them, because by destroying them, he was able to get rid of his own sort of debt to them. And it's like that idea, like we all owe the bank something. So if there's no bank, there's no debt. It's exactly that. So King Philip who was already deeply in debt to the Templars from his war against England, decided to seize upon the rumours of their purposes. He began pressuring the church to take action against the order as a way of freeing himself from his debt. The arrest warrant and started with the phrase, "God is not pleased. We have enemies of faith in the kingdom." See, the idea that the Templars were rotten from the inside. There was something wrong. They were called devil worshippers. They were given names that they were unholy, that they were sodomites, that they were fostering homosexuality within their group. They were everything that they could possibly throw at them at the time was labeled to them. And so there was I believe there was a mass sort of like execution of Templars over time. But let's read on. So claims were made during the Templar admission ceremony. Recruits were forced to spit on the cross, deny Christ, engage in indecent kissing. Brethren were also accused of worshipping idols, and the order was said to have encouraged homosexual practices. These allegations, though, were highly politicized without any real evidence. Exactly. And so on Friday the 13th, again, there's actually some debate on whether Friday the 13th came from this. 1307, scores of French Templars were arrested, including the order's Grand Master Jacques de Molay. Many of the knights were brutally tortured until they confessed to false charges, including heresy, homosexuality, financial corruption, devil worshipping, fraud, spitting on crosses, and much, much more. You see what I mean here? The French king, as we said, that France, a abbot in France, and the Catholic Church created the power that the Templars would use from a small amount to creating the multinational organization that they became. And then the French king and the Catholic Church took that away from them like that. And it's all over. The party's over. This era of financial control and the ability to move back and forth fluidly through Europe and through the Holy Land is no longer the Templars' domain anyway. A few years later, dozens of Templars were burned at the stake in Paris for their confessions. De Molay was executed in 1314. Under pressure from King Philip, Pope V reluctantly dissolved the Templars in 1312. The group's property and monetary assets were given to a rival order, the Knights Hospitallers. You see what I hear? The Hospitallers were a more religious group and more dedicated to the Catholic Church, which makes sense. However, it's thought that King Philip and Edward II of England seized most of the Knights Templars' wealth. Yeah, again, just political gains here from both sides, the French, the English. And I imagine both kings owed a lot of money to the Templars at the time. It's just that King Philip was, the one to have been known to have been in debt to this organization. And so, still, the Templars were charged with numerous other offences, such as financial corruption. Yeah, we said this. Many of the accused confessed to these charges under torture. The prisoners were coerced. Yep, and we said that as well. And the Templars were accused of idling. Yeah, and the headquarters at the Temple Mount were theorized to have been. Oh my goodness. Mummified remains of John the Baptist among the things that were found within the headquarters of the Templars. That's amazing. So originally, this group of men who were altruistically trying to protect the pilgrims going to and from the Holy Land become a corporation, an organization. I imagine at the beginning it was just purely as an organization to be able to go to and from the Holy Land, to be able to protect in the name of God, to serve the Catholic Church later on as well. But gradually, surely, its power gets out of control, and kings and popes join forces to destroy the organization that could have potentially gone on to become something bigger than a nation if allowed to. So, what happened to the Templars today? Well, as I've said, the Templars have a very mixed report across books, video games, films. It's all over the place. What we do know is that the Catholic Church have sort of put on record that the accusations of the Templars were false. So there is something really, really interesting about that, is the sense that if we talk to the Catholic Church now, is the Templars weren't in the wrong, and that they probably just coerced the by the kings, by those who had some sort of way to benefit from the Templars being destroyed. Um, there's some people nowadays who think that the Templars still exist through shadows, and I think there's there's even shadow groups nowadays that I think I've got it written down here actually, that the Templars were the Masons. That's it. The Masons. They're thought to have been absorbed into this group, um, where they still have this religious sort of encircling, and that power is still there, and that there's still financial assets in the group, and that there's still people pulling the puppetry strings of the world going on. However, I don't think that's the case, and I don't think that's um, possible with today's sort of social media, and with cameras, and the ability of people not to be able to shut their mouths. And let's be honest, after 5 minutes, everybody's got a damn story to tell. So, the Catholic Church has acknowledged that the prosecution of the Knights Templars was unjustified. The Church claims that Pope Clement was pressured by secular rulers to destroy the order. Yep. While most historians agree that the Knights Templar fully disbanded 700 years ago, there are some people who believe that the order was underground and remain in existence in some form to this day. In the 18th century, some groups, most notably the Freemasons, as I said, Masons, revived several of the medieval knights' symbols, rituals, and traditions. Currently, there are several international organizations styled after the Knights Templar that the public can join. These groups have representatives around the world and aim to uphold the values and traditions of the original medieval order. Throughout the years, various tales have surfaced about the Knights' mysterious work. More recently, stories about legendary Templars have found their way into popular books and movies, as I've said. So, all of that, I've thrown information at you guys, and I hope some of it sticks. The Templars went from 8 people, to be specifically, of family and friends and acquaintances, to a multinational banking group who are backed by the Catholic Church, who trade all over the world, who have ports, a whole fleet of ships, have they own land and they own structures all over Europe and all of Christendom, go from the highest point of battling in the name of Christ and the church, and fighting besides France, England, and many other nations within and tribes and groups within Europe, in the Holy Land against Saladin and the Muslim people, but then fall through the same way they rose. The French king and the Catholic Church demonized the group, and as the Catholic Church have stated, unlawfully and quite untruly, label them devil worshippers, homosexuals, and sodomites, and everything that you could possibly throw at somebody to get them executed or hung at the time. And so we see the rise and fall of the Templars in quite a short period of time. I've condensed a lot of information here. There's so much out there to talk about, And I'm going to continue to do these history series where we jump into some history, we grab onto it, write it, and we try and find as much as we can within that short period of time, and digest it and hopefully learn something, because I didn't know about half of these things about, at the end of the day. And after doing some research, it's fascinating to see this group become quite, going from my point of view, going from a group of knights who fought in the Holy Land, to gain land and do things for glory and for God wills it, to a financial mania sort of organization. And to this moment, just be blown away by the amount of influence they had over the countries at the time. And so I think we'll end it there. I'm gonna continue doing these series. We've done Russia, we've done Japan, we've done the Crusades, and who knows what we'll be doing next. If you got any suggestions, ping them my way. Any comments, anything you want to see next. And yeah, until next time, this has been a Taylor's Tales podcast. This has been Chris's Corner. I'm your host, Chris Taylor, and as always, thank you so much for listening.